The crackling fireplace painted the living room in a warm, golden hue as the crisp scent of pine and cinnamon wafted through the air. Snow cascaded gently outside, blanketing the world in serene white silence. Clara tightened her robe around herself and smiled at her husband, Michael, who sat near the Christmas tree, arranging presents with an almost exaggerated precision. Their 7-year-old son, Ethan, giggled nearby, shaking a brightly wrapped box. "Patience, buddy," Michael chuckled. His voice carried its usual charm, but there was a faint tremor Clara hadn't noticed before. She handed Ethan a steaming cup of cocoa and sat down on the couch, her gaze lingering on Michael. He had been distracted lately, working late nights and taking sudden phone calls in hushed tones. Clara had dismissed her suspicions for weeks, chalking them up to holiday stress. Yet, something had gnawed at her, a feeling that this morning would unravel more than ribbons and bows. The door to the kitchen swung open, and Maria, their maid, walked in, carrying a tray of cookies. Dressed modestly in a simple dress and apron, Maria had been with the family for 2 years. She placed the tray on the coffee table and smiled warmly at Ethan. But when her eyes met Michael's, something flickered. A fleeting exchange too intimate to ignore. Clara stiffened. "Maria, you've been such a help this year," she said, her tone honeyed but sharp. "You're practically part of the family." Michael's hand froze mid-reach for a gift. "Clara," he started, but she raised a hand, silencing him. "Actually, Maria," Clara continued, her voice now cold, "why don't you join us? It's Christmas, after all." Maria hesitated, glancing nervously at Michael, whose face had paled. She perched on the edge of a chair, hands clasped tightly in her lap. Ethan, oblivious, tore into his first present with glee. Clara leaned forward, picking up a neatly wrapped box with a red bow. "This one's from Michael to Maria," she said, her voice dripping with forced cheer. She handed it to Maria, who looked as though she might burst into tears. Maria glanced at Michael, who shook his head ever so slightly, then reluctantly unwrapped the gift. Inside was a delicate gold bracelet, the kind Clara knew Michael would never think to buy her. Clara's smile didn't falter, though her knuckles whitened as she gripped her mug. "A bracelet," she said softly. "How thoughtful, Michael. Did you pick it out yourself?" Michael opened his mouth, but no sound came. Maria tried to place the bracelet back in the box, her hands trembling. "I think," Clara said, her voice low and dangerous, "we need to have a family talk." Ethan's head popped up. "Now?" "Yes, sweetheart," Clara said, her gaze locked on Michael. "Go play in your room for a bit." Ethan hesitated but obeyed, leaving the 3 adults in a suffocating silence. "I know," Clara said the moment the boy's footsteps disappeared. "I know everything. The late nights, the texts, the extra cleaning shifts." Her voice cracked, but her eyes burned with fury. "How long has this been going on?" Michael stammered. "It's not what you think." "Don't you dare insult me with lies," Clara snapped. She turned to Maria. "And you. I welcomed you into my home, trusted you with my child." Maria's face crumpled. "I never meant for this to happen. I swear." "Enough," Clara hissed, standing abruptly. She snatched the bracelet and hurled it into the fire. The flames licked greedily at the gold, turning it into ash. "Pack your things, Maria," she said, her voice icy. "You're leaving tonight." Michael stepped forward. "Clara, let's talk about this." She glared at him, her voice now trembling with suppressed rage. "Oh, we'll talk, Michael. But not before she's gone." Maria bolted from the room, her muffled sobs echoing through the hall. Clara turned to her husband, who stood frozen by the tree. The glow of the Christmas lights cast shadows across his face, making him look smaller, almost pathetic. "This was supposed to be a season of love, Michael," Clara whispered bitterly. "But all you've given me is betrayal." As the snow fell heavier outside, Michael finally sank into the armchair, his head in his hands. The festive warmth of the room now felt like a cruel mockery of the shattered peace within it. The door slammed upstairs as Maria fled, leaving Clara and Michael alone in the suffocating tension of the living room. The crackling fire seemed louder now, the cheerful sound mocking the silence between them. Michael sat, his head buried in his hands, while Clara stood motionless, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. Her breathing was sharp, uneven. For a moment, it seemed as if neither of them would speak. "Clara, please," Michael finally said, his voice hoarse. "Let me explain." "Explain?" She spat, her eyes narrowing. "Explain what, Michael? That you've been sleeping with our maid while I was busy holding this family together? That you've made a fool of me in my own home? It wasn't like that," he insisted, standing now, his palms up in a gesture of surrender. "It wasn't serious. It was a mistake. A terrible mistake." Her laughter was bitter and sharp, cutting through his words. "Not serious? You bought her jewelry, Michael. Jewelry. You've never even thought to get me something so personal. How long has this been going on?" Michael's mouth opened, but he hesitated. That pause was enough for Clara. Her voice rose, shaking with fury. "Months? Years? How long have you been lying to me?" 3 months, he admitted quietly, his eyes downcast. "But I swear it's over. I didn't mean for it to happen. It just— Don't you dare say it just happened," she shouted, taking a step closer. Her hand shot out, and for a moment Michael flinched, expecting a slap. But she only pointed at him, trembling with rage. "You made choices, Michael. Every text, every stolen moment, you chose this. You betrayed me." Michael sank back into the chair, his shoulders slumping as if the weight of his actions had finally crushed him. "I know," he murmured. "I've ruined everything. But I love you, Clara. I love our family." Clara's expression softened for just a second, pain flickering in her eyes, before the anger returned. "If you loved me, you wouldn't have done this. You wouldn't have risked destroying everything we built." They stood in silence, the only sound the faint whistle of the wind outside and the occasional pop of the fire. Clara turned away, her hands running through her hair as she paced the room. "I trusted you," she whispered, more to herself than him. "I gave you everything, Michael, and this is what I get in return." "I'm sorry," he said weakly. "I'll do anything to fix this. I'll go to therapy, quit my job if you want, whatever it takes." She turned back to him, her eyes glistening. "You think an apology can erase this? That you can undo the humiliation I've felt? The suspicion I ignored? You shattered my trust, Michael. How do we come back from that?" Michael didn't answer. He couldn't. Clara took a deep breath, steadying herself. "For now, you'll stay in the guest room. I need time to think, to figure out if there's anything left worth saving." He looked up, desperation etched across his face. "Clara, please." "Not another word," she snapped, cutting him off. "If you care about me at all, you'll give me space." Michael nodded silently, rising to his feet and retreating upstairs without another protest. His footsteps were heavy, each one echoing like a reminder of his betrayal. Clara stood alone by the tree, the cheerful twinkle of the lights reflected in her tear-streaked eyes. For a long moment, she stared at the gifts beneath it, the remnants of what was supposed to be a perfect Christmas morning. She reached down and picked up a small, wrapped box with her name on it. Michael's handwriting was on the tag. Slowly, she unwrapped it, revealing a delicate silver necklace with a pendant shaped like a snowflake. It was beautiful, thoughtful, even, but it felt meaningless now, like an empty gesture from a man she no longer recognized. Clara placed the necklace on the mantel, next to a family photo taken just last Christmas. In the picture, they were smiling, arms wrapped around each other, happiness radiating from their faces. Felt like a lifetime ago. As the fire burned low and the morning turned to afternoon, Clara sat alone, trying to grasp the enormity of what had happened. She wasn't sure if forgiveness was possible. All she knew was that the life she'd known had crumbled, leaving her to sift through the ashes. The afternoon sun cast long, pale beams across the living room as the snowstorm outside thickened. Clara remained seated near the dimming fire, staring into the embers as if they held answers. The house was eerily quiet, stripped of the usual joy and chaos of Christmas Day. She could hear the occasional creak of the floorboards above as Michael moved about, likely in the guest room. He hadn't dared come down since their confrontation, and Clara wasn't sure if she felt relief or resentment about his silence. Her thoughts were a chaotic mess. Anger, heartbreak, and confusion tumbling over one another like an unrelenting tide. A knock at the door startled her. She frowned. Visitors were the last thing she wanted. Rising reluctantly, she pulled her robe tighter and walked to the door. When she opened it, a blast of cold air greeted her, along with the sight of Maria standing on the porch, her cheeks flushed from the cold. "What are you doing here?" Clara demanded, her voice sharp. Maria clutched a small suitcase in one hand, a scarf wrapped tightly around her neck. Her eyes were red, but she held herself with an unexpected firmness. "I came to apologize," she said softly, her breath visible in the icy air. Clara stiffened, gripping the edge of the door. "Apologies don't change what you've done. You betrayed me, Maria. I welcomed you into my home." "I know," Maria whispered. Her voice trembled, but she pressed on. "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I need you to understand. It wasn't just about Michael." Clara's brow furrowed. "What are you talking about?" Maria glanced over her shoulder, as if to ensure no one else was listening, then stepped closer. "Can I come in? Please, just for a moment." Every instinct told Clara to slam the door in her face, but something in Maria's expression, a mix of desperation and guilt, made her hesitate. With a sigh, she stepped aside, allowing Maria into the warmth of the house. Maria placed her suitcase by the door and stood awkwardly in the foyer, her eyes darting to the floor. Clara crossed her arms, her patience thin. "Well," Maria took a deep breath. "Michael and it wasn't love. It wasn't even about him, really. It was a distraction, a way to survive." Clara's eyes narrowed. "Survive? What does that even mean?" "I've been in trouble, Mrs. Peterson," Maria said, her voice breaking. "My family, they're in danger. I borrowed money from someone I shouldn't have to help my mother back home. When I couldn't pay it back, they started threatening me, following me. I was terrified." Clara's jaw tightened, skepticism warring with curiosity. "And you thought seducing my husband was the solution?" "No." Maria shook her head vehemently. "I didn't plan for anything to happen. But when Michael started paying attention to me, being kind, it felt like an escape. A way to feel safe, even for a little while." She swallowed hard, tears glistening in her eyes. "It was selfish. I know that. But I didn't know what else to do." Clara stared at her, anger still simmering beneath the surface. "You could have come to me, told me the truth." Maria laughed bitterly. "And what would I have said? Your maid has a debt to criminals and is being threatened? I didn't think you'd care." Clara's lips parted, but no words came. The reality of Maria's confession mingled with her own pain, leaving her feeling more conflicted than ever. Maria stepped forward, her voice earnest. "I'm leaving tonight. You won't see me again. But I had to tell you. I'm sorry for what I've done, Mrs. Peterson. Truly. And I hope someday you can believe that." Clara regarded Maria for a long moment, her heart and mind at war. Finally, she nodded stiffly. "You should go." Maria bowed her head and picked up her suitcase. As she opened the door, the wind howled, carrying snowflakes into the foyer. She hesitated on the threshold, glancing back one last time. "I hope you and Ethan have a Merry Christmas, despite everything." And then she was gone, her figure disappearing into the snowy night. Clara closed the door and leaned against it, her head throbbing. She felt as though she'd been handed another piece of a puzzle she hadn't wanted to solve. Michael's betrayal was clear, but now Maria's confession added layers of complexity she hadn't anticipated. As the evening wore on, Clara sat alone in the living room, her thoughts a tempest. She replayed every moment, every revelation, searching for clarity in the chaos. Outside, the snowstorm raged, but inside, she felt an even deeper storm brewing within her. When she finally rose to turn out the lights, She paused by the family photo on the mantel. Her gaze lingered on Michael's smiling face. For the first time, she wasn't sure if she could see the man she thought she had married, or if she even wanted to. The hours crept past as darkness fell completely over the house. Clara sat in the kitchen now, nursing a glass of wine that had long since gone warm. The house was silent, save for the faint ticking of the clock on the wall. She had replayed every word Maria had said, every glance exchanged between Michael and the maid, over and over in her mind. Her anger had not dissipated, but it had shifted, sharpening into a cold resolve. She needed answers, real answers. She left the kitchen and made her way upstairs. The hall was dimly lit, the guest room door ajar. Inside, Michael sat on the edge of the bed, his shoulders slumped, his head bowed. He didn't look up as Clara entered. "We're talking now," she said, her tone firm. "No excuses, no dodging. You're going to tell me the truth. Every last bit of it." Michael looked up, his face drawn and tired. "Clara, I've told you everything." "No," she interrupted sharply. "You've told me what you thought I wanted to hear. But you're not just guilty of cheating, Michael. Maria told me why she got involved with you. About her debt, the threats. So tell me, what else don't I know?" His eyes widened, and for a moment, panic flickered across his face. "She told you about that?" Clara crossed her arms, her lips pressing into a thin line. "Yes, and now I want to know what you've been hiding from me." Michael exhaled heavily and leaned back against the wall, rubbing his hands over his face. "It's not what you think," he said finally. "Maria's debt. I tried to help her." Clara's laugh was bitter. "Help her? Is that what you call it?" "Yes," Michael snapped, his voice rising for the first time. "She came to me desperate, Clara, crying. She said these people were going to hurt her family if she didn't pay them back. I felt sorry for her. I didn't know what to do, so I gave her some money." Clara's brows shot up. "How much?" $5,000, he admitted, his voice quieter now. "I transferred it to her, hoping it would buy her some time. But then things escalated." "Escalated," Clara repeated coldly. "And by escalated, you mean you slept with her?" Michael buried his face in his hands again. "It wasn't supposed to happen. I never meant for it to go that far." "But it did," Clara said, her tone like ice. "And you still didn't think to tell me? What was I supposed to say?" Michael shouted, standing now. "That I gave our maid thousands of dollars and made the worst mistake of my life? I was trying to fix it without dragging you into it." She stepped closer, her eyes blazing. "And instead, you dragged our entire family into your mess. Do you think this doesn't affect Ethan? Do you think it doesn't shatter everything I thought I knew about you?" Michael's shoulders sagged, the fight draining out of him. "I know I've ruined everything. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness. But I swear to you, Clara, I was only trying to help." Clara stared at him, her chest heaving with emotion. For a long moment, the only sound was the muffled howl of the wind outside. Then she took a deep breath, her voice trembling. "I don't know if I can believe you, Michael. And even if I could, I don't know if I can forgive you." He reached out to her, his hand hovering in the space between them. "Please, Clara, don't give up on us. I'll do whatever it takes." She stepped back, his outstretched hand falling to his side. "Whatever it takes. Then start by sleeping somewhere else tonight. Tomorrow we'll figure out the rest." Michael nodded, defeated, and Clara left the room, her footsteps echoing down the hall. Back in her bedroom, she shut the door and leaned against it, her breath catching in her throat. She had demanded the truth, but the weight of it threatened to crush her. As she climbed into bed, the storm outside reached its peak, the wind rattling the windows. Clara stared at the ceiling, her mind racing. Forgiveness felt impossibly far away, but one thing was certain. The man she had married was a stranger now, and she would have to decide if there was any path forward, or if their life together had ended with this bitter, broken Christmas. The storm quieted by morning, leaving the world outside cloaked in a deceptively tranquil blanket of snow. The pale winter sun peeked through the curtains as Clara stirred from a fitful sleep. Her mind felt as heavy as her limbs. The weight of the previous day's revelations had followed her into her dreams, and there was no escape upon waking. She rose, pulled a sweater over her shoulders, and padded into the hallway. Ethan's door was still closed, his soft snores audible. For a moment, she lingered there, her heart aching. Whatever decisions she made today would ripple through his life, reshaping his world as much as her own. In the kitchen, the coffee pot gurgled faintly as she leaned against the counter. The aroma was comforting, a small reminder of normalcy. But even that solace felt fragile. She poured a cup and sat at the table, staring into the steaming liquid as if it might hold answers. Michael appeared in the doorway. He looked disheveled, his shirt rumpled and his eyes bloodshot. He hesitated, then stepped inside, holding his hands up in a tentative gesture of peace. "Clara," he began quietly, "I know you don't want to hear much from me right now, but I need to say this." She glanced up at him, her expression unreadable, and said nothing. "I've been up all night thinking about everything," he said, sitting across from her. His voice was hoarse but steady. "About how I got here, how I let everything fall apart." Clara raised an eyebrow. And, I know there's no excuse for what I did," he said, his hands clasped tightly together. "But I need you to understand that none of it was about you. It wasn't because I stopped loving you or because I didn't care about our family." She let out a hollow laugh. "So it just happened, then? Like a car accident or a freak storm?" Michael winced. "No, I'm not saying that. I'm saying I made terrible choices. Choices I regret more than anything I've ever done in my life. But Clara, if you'll let me, I want to fix this. I want to fix us." Her gaze was piercing, cutting through his words. "Fix us? Michael, do you even understand the damage you've done? You broke something that doesn't mend with apologies or promises. Trust isn't a faucet you can just turn back on." He nodded, swallowing hard. "I know, but I'll do whatever it takes. Therapy, counseling, moving away if that's what you want. I need to know if there's even a chance." Clara leaned back, crossing her arms. She studied him for a long moment, searching his face for sincerity. "Do you even know what you want, Michael? Or are you just grasping at straws because you're afraid of losing your comfortable life?" He flinched as if struck, but his gaze didn't waver. "I want you," he said firmly. "I want us. And I know I don't deserve a second chance, but I'm asking for one anyway." The air between them was thick, heavy with the weight of unspoken pain and lingering love. Clara's grip on her coffee cup tightened. "I don't have an answer for you," she said finally, her voice quiet but resolute. "Not yet. Maybe not for a long time." Michael nodded, his expression a mixture of relief and heartbreak. "I'll wait," he said, "as long as it takes." She stood, carrying her cup to the sink. Her back was to him when she spoke again. "We'll go to therapy. That's the first step. But don't think for a second that this is about saving you, Michael. This is about me figuring out whether I can rebuild a life with you in it, or if I'm better off without you." Her words hung in the air like a verdict. Michael didn't respond, but she could hear his sharp intake of breath. Ethan's voice called from upstairs, breaking the tension. "Mom, is it time for breakfast?" Clara turned, brushing past Michael without meeting his eyes. "I'll get Ethan ready. You can make breakfast." He nodded mutely, moving toward the stove as she climbed the stairs. For the first time, Clara felt the faintest glimmer of control returning, even if it was tenuous and small. This Christmas hadn't brought joy or peace. But as Clara watched Ethan's sleepy smile when she entered his room, she realized it had given her one thing: clarity. Her family's future was uncertain, but it would be hers to decide. And for now, that was enough. The morning wore on with a strange quietness, the kind that follows a storm. Not just the snowstorm that had passed, but the tempest within their family. Clara focused on the motions of the day, keeping her hands busy. She made sure Ethan had his breakfast, bundled him in warm clothes, and helped him pick out a puzzle to work on by the fireplace. Michael stayed out of her way, keeping to the kitchen and offering only small, careful gestures. A plate of pancakes left on the table for her, a cup of fresh coffee set nearby without a word. Clara acknowledged none of it, keeping her attention firmly on Ethan. Midway through the day, Clara found herself staring out the window at the snowy expanse of their backyard. The world looked pristine, untouched by the chaos that had unraveled inside the house. Ethan's laughter drifted in from the living room, where he played with his new toys. For a moment, Clara allowed herself to breathe, to let the noise of her thoughts fade. "Mom, come see this." Ethan's voice broke through her reverie. She turned and walked back to the living room, where Ethan was proudly showing off a tower he'd built with his new blocks. "It's amazing, sweetheart," she said with a smile, kneeling beside him. Her fingers brushed his hair, and he grinned up at her. Michael hovered near the doorway, watching them. His presence was quiet, almost ghost-like, but Clara felt it. She turned, her expression hardening slightly. "Ethan, why don't you keep building? I'll be right back." Ethan nodded, already engrossed in his next creation. As Clara rose and motioned for Michael to follow her into the hallway, he did, his steps hesitant. "I need to set some ground rules," she said once they were out of earshot. "Of course," Michael replied quickly. "Anything. For now, this is how it's going to work," Clara said, her voice firm. "We'll go to therapy, as I said, but until I feel I can trust you again, or if I ever can, our relationship is strictly co-parenting. You'll stay in the guest room. No pretending everything's fine, especially not in front of Ethan." Michael nodded, his face etched with regret. "I understand. And," she continued, "you will give me access to every part of your life, your phone, your emails, your finances. No secrets. If there's even a hint of dishonesty, it's over. No more chances." His throat bobbed as he swallowed. "You have my word." Clara's eyes narrowed. "Your word doesn't mean much to me right now, Michael, but you'll have the opportunity to prove it." Michael looked down, shame flickering across his face. "I know I've put us in a terrible place, but I'm not giving up, Clara. I'll do whatever it takes." "Good," she said curtly, "because this is your last chance." As she turned to walk back to Ethan, Michael called after her softly. "Thank you, Clara, for even giving me that." She paused, her shoulders stiff. Without looking back, she replied, "Don't thank me yet." The rest of the day passed in a delicate balance. Clara and Michael managed the tasks of the afternoon, lunch, cleaning, a few moments outside in the snow with Ethan without incident. But the unspoken tension between them was ever present, a shadow that refused to lift. That evening, after Ethan was tucked into bed, Clara found herself back in the living room, staring at the remnants of Christmas. The tree still twinkled with lights, but it no longer felt festive. The gifts under the tree seemed like relics from a life that no longer existed. Michael entered the room, a glass of water in hand. He hesitated near the doorway, then approached cautiously. "Can I sit?" Clara gestured to the armchair across from her, and he sat down, cradling the glass like a shield. They sat in silence for a long moment, the weight of everything unsaid pressing down on them. "Do you ever think about how we got here?" Michael asked finally, his voice low. "All the time," Clara replied without hesitation. "And every time, I wonder how I didn't see it sooner." Michael winced but didn't argue. "I don't expect you to believe this, but I still love you, Clara. I've never stopped." She met his gaze, her expression unreadable. "If you loved me, Michael, you wouldn't have betrayed me. Love doesn't do that." His face fell and he looked down at his hands. "I don't know how to fix this. I just know I want to." Clara sighed, her exhaustion seeping into her voice. "You can't undo what's been done. The only thing you can do is try to be better. And maybe, just maybe, I'll decide that's enough." He nodded, accepting her words as the only truth he had left to cling to. The night deepened, and Clara eventually rose, heading upstairs without another word. Michael stayed behind, staring into the empty space she left behind. The silence was deafening, but it was better than the alternative. A silence born from her absence forever. As Clara climbed into bed, She felt no peace, no resolution. Only the knowledge that tomorrow would come, and with it, more decisions to make. But for the first time, she felt the faintest stirrings of strength, a glimmer of hope that, no matter what, she would find her way forward, whether with Michael or without him. The days after Christmas were quiet but tense, like the calm following a landslide. Clara threw herself into routine, keeping Ethan at the center of her focus. She took him sledding in the park, helped him assemble his new puzzles, and read his favorite bedtime stories until he fell asleep with a contented smile. Ethan's laughter was a fragile bomb, but it was enough to keep her moving forward. Michael, true to his word, stayed in the background. He didn't press Clara for conversations, nor did he try to force his way back into her good graces. He cooked meals, cleaned without being asked, and tried to keep the house running smoothly. But his attempts at atonement only deepened the ache in Clara's chest. She couldn't tell if his gestures were genuine or born out of guilt. One evening, about a week after Christmas, Clara sat alone at the dining table, flipping through an old photo album she'd found while clearing out a cabinet. The images stared back at her. Smiling faces, family vacations, celebrations filled with warmth and laughter. There was one photo in particular that caught her eye, a snapshot of her and Michael from their first anniversary. They were at the beach, the sun setting behind them, her head on his shoulder as he kissed her temple. She didn't recognize the people in the photo anymore. The sound of footsteps drew her attention. Michael appeared in the doorway holding 2 cups of tea. He hesitated, then approached, setting 1 cup in front of her. "I thought you might need this," he said softly. Clara glanced at the cup, then at him. "Thanks." He lingered, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. "What are you looking at?" "Memories," she replied, her voice tinged with bitterness. "From before everything fell apart." Michael pulled out a chair and sat across from her, keeping his distance. "I miss those days," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Clara closed the album and leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms. "You don't get to say that. You're the one who destroyed those days, Michael." "I know," he said quickly. "I know I did, and I'd do anything to take it back." "But you can't," Clara said, her tone sharper now. "You can't go back. Neither of us can." Michael rubbed the back of his neck, his face clouded with regret. "I don't know how to fix this, Clara. I don't know how to make you believe me when I say I'm sorry." She exhaled slowly, trying to steady the storm brewing in her chest. "The thing is, Michael, I don't know if I want to fix this. I don't know if I want us anymore." His eyes widened, pain flashing across his face. "Clara." "Stop," she interrupted, holding up a hand. "You don't get to beg. You don't get to guilt me into staying. This isn't just about what you want, Michael. It's about what's best for me and Ethan." Michael swallowed hard, his hands gripping the edge of the table. "I'm not trying to guilt you. I'm just asking for a chance. A real chance to prove to you that I can change." Clara stared at him, her emotions warring inside her. She wanted to scream at him, to make him feel the depth of her pain. But she was too tired, too drained to fight. "Therapy," she said finally. "If we're going to try, we do it with professional help. No shortcuts, no excuses." He nodded fervently. "Anything you want, I'll do it. And," she continued, her voice firm, "you need to deal with Maria's mess. Whatever threats she's facing, whoever she owes money to, you make it right. I won't have this hanging over our family." Michael looked startled but nodded again. "I'll take care of it." Clara stood, picking up her cup of tea. "Good, because this is your last chance, Michael. If you mess this up, we're done." He watched her leave, his chest tight with both fear and hope. For the first time in days, he felt a sliver of light piercing through the darkness. Upstairs, Clara stood by Ethan's door, peeking in to watch him sleep. His peaceful face reminded her of what mattered most. Whether or not Michael could rebuild her trust, Clara knew one thing for certain. She would protect her son, and herself, no matter what. And as she turned away, she felt a glimmer of strength she hadn't felt in a long time. The strength to face whatever came next. The new year arrived with a muted sense of hope and finality. Clara stood in the kitchen early that morning, watching the pale light filter through the frosted windows. Outside, the world was still, the snow sparkling like it belonged to a painting. She sipped her coffee and thought about the road ahead. It had been a turbulent week since Christmas. Therapy appointments were scheduled, but the real work had already begun. Michael had spent hours on the phone, arranging payments to cover Maria's debt and ensuring her safety. Clara had listened from a distance, her skepticism firmly intact. Words and gestures weren't enough anymore, only actions mattered. Michael entered the kitchen, his presence careful and quiet, like someone stepping into a fragile space. He poured himself a cup of coffee and stood a few feet away, his gaze flicking to her and then back to his mug. "Happy New Year," he said softly. Clara didn't reply right away. Her silence was deliberate, measured. She set her cup down and turned to him, crossing her arms. "This year is going to be different, Michael, and I mean that for both of us." He nodded, his grip tightening on the mug. "I understand. I'm still here," she said, her voice steady. "But not because of you. I'm here for Ethan, for myself, and because I'm not ready to walk away without knowing I did everything I could to make this decision for the right reasons." Michael's face was etched with a mixture of gratitude and guilt. "That's all I can ask for. But," she continued, her tone hardening, "I'm not guaranteeing anything. Therapy is just the start. If I feel for even a moment that this is a mistake, I'm leaving. And I won't look back." He nodded again, his throat tight. "I'll do whatever it takes." Clara leaned against the counter, her gaze steady. "Good, because this is your last chance. Not just to fix our marriage, but to show me that you can be the man Ethan deserves as a father." Michael swallowed, his voice barely audible. "I will." The sound of footsteps interrupted the moment, and Ethan appeared in the doorway, rubbing his eyes and clutching his favorite stuffed bear. "Morning, Mom." "Morning, Dad." Clara turned, her expression softening. "Morning, sweetheart. Did you sleep well?" Ethan nodded, walking over to wrap his arms around her waist. Clara hugged him tightly, closing her eyes for a moment. When she opened them, Michael was watching, his expression unreadable. The three of them sat down for breakfast, the table unusually quiet but not uncomfortable. It felt like the first tentative step toward something new. Not reconciliation, but something steadier, more grounded. Clara didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in weeks, she felt like she was walking toward it with her eyes wide open. Later that evening, after Ethan was tucked into bed, Clara stood alone by the fireplace. The remnants of Christmas were still there. The tree, the lights, the faint scent of pine. She stared at the flames, letting their warmth wash over her. Michael approached, standing at a respectful distance. He didn't speak, didn't ask for forgiveness or answers. Instead, he simply stood there, a presence rather than a plea. Clara turned to him, her expression unreadable. "This is the last time I'll say it, Michael. Don't disappoint me again." He nodded solemnly. "I won't." As he walked away, leaving her alone with the flickering fire, Clara let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. She didn't know if she believed him. She didn't know if she wanted to. But she did know this. No matter what happened, she had found her strength again. And with that, she could face whatever came next. The snow outside fell softly, blanketing the world in quiet renewal. For the first time in a long while, Clara felt a small sense of peace. A new year, a new beginning on her terms.